It was with idle curiosity that I turned into Baker Street and paused outside 221B, remembering my old friend Sherlock Holmes and the adventures we embarked upon. The building was much the same, and I chanced to think whether Mrs. Hudson still lived there, when I saw a faint light glow from an upstairs window and a shadow pass gently across the wide lace curtains. The shadow was tall, thin, and with a start of surprise I connected the shape with that of Holmes, not just in look and outline, but also in the steady, graceful movement, or almost gliding across my field of vision. If I did not know Holmes was retired and living in Surrey tending bees, I would have thought of rapping on the door and inquiring within. The shadow passed 2 more times, and then, with faint disappointment, the lace curtains cast to one side, and a squat-looking man wearing a cap and sporting braces over a white billowing shirt looked out into the street below and, seeing my glare, shut the curtains with some irritation. The man looked nothing like Holmes, and so, putting that first shadowy form down to wishful thinking, I made my way along the street towards Regent's Park to finish my evening constitution. I was enjoying my semi-retirement, and apart from the occasional consultancy work and some papers I regularly contributed to the Medical Association, I was free to keep my own time. And so, after my evening stroll, I would generally take to my club, perhaps to play some rounds of cards or catch up on the latest newspapers from around the world. I would have a cigar and a very fine sherry of which I was particularly fond. I was at peace, a creature of habit, surely, but after my wilder day was with Holmes and my own consultancy and 2 marriages, my lessened activity, if a little predictable and dull, was very welcome. I now resided in Mansfield Street, parallel to Harley Street, and my evening strolls usually took me down that famous fine Doctor's Row to York Terrace, then a quick cross of the road and into Regent's Park's York Bridge entrance. For reasons seemingly without my knowledge, I had walked a roundabout way to take in Baker Street before visiting the park, perhaps because my thoughts had been curious about Holmes that day, having not heard from him for several years. I often think of my old friend and wondered how retirement suited him. So after a pleasant stroll around the park, taking in the fine colours of a crisp autumn evening, I decided to take the right turning from the park rather than left, and again enter Baker Street, stopping once more at the building. The golden light from the window was now shadowed by thicker curtains which had hastily been pulled in front. There again, much to my surprise, between a slim gap within the curtains, was that thin shadow, flitting back and forth. And yes, there, as I looked, I saw another shape, the shape of the aforementioned squat man in the cap. The 2 shadows met and parted as though in great discussion, pacing the floor of 221B, much as Holmes and I had done at the height of our adventures. With considerable difficulty I started to continue my walk home, but I could not remove the ridiculous idea that Holmes was now within his old quarters, and if I did not at least inquire within, I would not rest from this continuous vexation. Crossing the street, I knocked upon the door with some agitation. I wondered what I might say once the door was answered, but I decided I would simply explain I used to reside here and was interested in seeing my old rooms once again. Feeling ridiculous and somewhat embarrassed, the door suddenly flew open, and a young woman wearing an apron and holding a small baby in her arms looked at me inquisitively. "Excuse me," I said, but I used to... "Dr. Watson," said the young woman, much to my surprise. "Dr. Watson, I've heard so much about you," she said again, breaking into a smile. I realized I was momentarily stunned, and as I recovered my voice and asked how she knew me, she laughed and, hitching the baby onto one hip, turned into the hallway I knew so well. She called out, and an elderly lady, who by shape and movement was most familiar, came into view. She clapped her hands and gave me a warm hug before I could remonstrate. "Dr. Watson," Mrs. Hudson said, "you too." Mrs. Hudson, considerably frail-looking and with a stick, beckoned me in and, introducing her niece, who now runs the household, told me to follow Mary up the stairs to my old rooms. I stammered. I was only passing and was curious as to see them, and she waved me on. "We're just off on an errand," Mrs. Hudson called out as she scuttled off to her old rooms downstairs. I followed Mary up to the rooms above. With such a curious sensation of returning into my past life, I hesitated on the landing. "Excuse me, but I feel the person, or persons," I said, remembering the two shadows, "may not want to be disturbed." Mary chuckled at this. "Don't you worry," she said, knocking on the Holmes' door. After knocking, Mary left me and took herself and the baby back down the stairway to collect Mrs. Hudson. I heard the front door click and click shut, and their footsteps fade away on the pavement outside. Waiting a moment, I had the utmost urgency to run back down towards the street, when all at once the door opened with a swift motion, and the squat man in the flat cap stood, now capless, in the frame. Beyond, I could see the furnished room and felt the heat of a well-lit fire. "Sorry," I stammered. I was passing by, and Mrs. Hudson said it was quite all right to—" The man opened the door further, and without speaking gestured that I should enter. I felt I needed to explain as to why I was there and what my mission was, and so, stammering some incoherent explanation, even to my ears, I crossed into the room. My eyes had been wholly focused on the man and his steady glare, so by the time I had turned from him to the rest of the room, another figure caught my attention, not just because it confirmed the tall shadow I'd seen in my window, but because it was as known to me as my own shadow. Leaning over the mantelpiece, a pipe in one hand and the other brushing through greyer hair, older but by no means much changed by the advancing years, the lean figure of Mr. Sherlock Holmes smiled at me with a look I so very often knew.
"Hello, Watson,"
said he.
"I'm so very glad to see you."
I flew towards him and shook his hand as warmly as I could muster. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, what delight! I cannot believe it. Why are you here?" I said, glancing round at the furnished room. "Are you back for good?" Holmes smiled.
"I'm afraid not, old friend. I'm here because Mr. Jacobi—"
And here he gestured towards the man who had let me in.
"Asked for me. These are his rooms now, Watson. Not mine."
I nodded to Mr. Jacobi. I see," I said, a little disappointed, though not entirely surprised. "Of course, it would be too much to hope for," I stammered, and sat in the chair nearest the fire and felt the warmth through my long coat.
"But oh, Watson, how delightful to see you. You look a little greyer, perhaps, and may have been too fond of dining at your local club, but it is the same old Watson."
I felt my belt dig into my waist as Holmes sat opposite, and on reflex my stomach pulled itself in a few inches.
"You look very well, Watson,"
Holmes said as he sat opposite.
"Live alone, I see, but you have a cook and a maid, and play bridge regularly at your club."
Apart from the presence of the silent Mr. Jacobi, I felt the years fall away. I was once more looking into that earnest and stern face, tips of his long fingers together, pipe in the side of his mouth, and legs stretched out towards the fireplace. "I need not ask how you know these things, Holmes," I said, smiling. "But pray tell me, for old time's sake." Holmes smiled too, and I felt we were like a couple of naughty schoolboys sharing a ridiculous private joke at the expense of the teachers.
"The cook is explained by your fuller, by no means unpleasant shape."
I coughed at this and shifted uncomfortably in my chair.
"There are a mere few added pounds, Watson, nothing to be ashamed of for a man in his prime of retirement. Your cook must be a good one, and your routine no longer requires you to chase wild dogs across the moor."
"More's the pity," I said.
"Indeed. Your maid keeps you looking well turned out, your coat buttoned, your ties tied. A man alone would not care to venture for so much of an appearance, wearing perhaps the same waistcoats, but yours has a freshly pressed look, clean and well tailored. As you are no longer married to your second wife, I feel another careful woman's touch keeps you looking every part the retired gentleman doctor you deserve to be."
"Wouldn't like to hazard a guess at a name, I don't suppose," I said to Holmes with jest.
"I'm an observer of facts, Watson, not a mind reader."
"Go on," I said. "The bridge. How could you possibly know I play regular bridge games?"
"Yes, here comes the clever part,"
Holmes said, puffing on his pipe.
"You told me by letter 2 years ago when you and your partner won third prize at a local competition, and even sent me the clipping from the Times, which I still have pinned to my notice board."
"Oh. I wrote and told you that?" I was aghast at my egotistical affront to think Holmes would be interested in the ramblings of my card-playing prowess. "I'm sorry, it must have been a slow week for writing," I commented, bringing a rare laugh from Holmes and a smile that changed his serious features to a kind benevolence.
Now,
He said.
you being here has saved me at least one small journey.
"Which is?" I said.
Finding you.
Holmes chuckled.
My dear man, you would not think, would you, that I would embark on a dangerous mission out of retirement alone? I need you, Watson, as I ever did.
I was at once humbled and alarmed. Dangerous, Holmes?
Very.
Well, what on earth could it be?
I will tell you, my friend, and when I do, you must seriously consider your welfare. I only put the question. I do not expect you to lay down your peaceful retirement or, indeed, your life for me. It is too much you must tell me immediately, and I will understand. We are older gentlemen than we are.
Holmes, I said, I am in.
Well, you do not know what I'm about to tell you.
Holmes, I am in, I said with feeling. Holmes broke into a wide smile and, jumping up somewhat like his old energy, he said,
Good man.
Rescuing his matches from the mantelpiece and relighting his pipe.
Now,
He said.
listen carefully. Let me tell you all.
Holmes sat back in his chair and fixed me with his gaze.
The situation is twofold. Firstly, the reason I'm currently situated back in my old haunts is because of the good grace of Mr. Jacoby here. As you may know, I have piles of correspondence calling for my services, but as I am retired and determined to remain so, I have left no forwarding address. Mr. Jacoby, therefore, by the goodness of his heart and for little return, opens each letter, finds the address, and without reading, promptly seals a printed general reply outlining my current situation and lists a few consulting detectives I thoroughly recommended in my retirement. I do not see these letters, you understand. If I did, my inquisitive nature may get the better of me, and I would surely be back into the fray once more. I retired for a reason, Watson. I simply had enough.
I remember, Holmes, I said.
Of course, there have been one or two cases in my part of the world that I decided to solve, but very seldom and on my terms. In the main, I avoid society and all its qualms.
Happy with your beekeeping, I said, remembering the delight Holmes had in showing me his extraordinary creatures on one of my earlier visits to Surrey.
Yes, indeed.
Holmes said, then he added,
For one reason or another, one letter got through.
Holmes sat forward and looked into the fire. I could see the strain in his eyes, and he lapsed into a silence which I knew well. I looked at Jacoby, who sat quite still on a hard-backed chair, waiting along with his special guest. Finally, Holmes leaned back.
Jacoby was piling letters into the post bag, ready to be sorted back at the post office to their various correspondents. One letter, in sprawling writing, he picked up, realised he had not sealed the printed reply back into the correspondence envelope, so opened it quickly to look at the address therein. On doing so, a key and a lock of hair fell to the floor.
Good gracious, I said, looking at Mr. Jacoby, who was non-committal as to Holmes's description of the letter's contents.
Jacoby placed them on the table and then searched the letter for a return address, but he stopped in his tracks by what was written there.
Which was, Holmes?
Help me, Mr. Holmes, help me.
No address?
None.
But how was the writer to know you had received the letter and your reply?
They would not know it. They gambled on me knowing them.
From a key and a lock of hair?
Yes.
I sat dumbfounded. Finally, I asked, So you must know to whom these items belong? They're confident they do not need to identify themselves.
Yes, that's right, Watson. I must know who this person is, and that was Mr. Jacoby's thinking. Seeing that there was great peril scrawled in this handwritten note, he felt he could not ignore the message. He wrote to the local post office, which is where, I informed him many years ago, if ever there was a problem he could find me. He sent a brief message describing the two items. As the correspondent thinks I still live here, and not wishing to enter into any investigation from the safety of my anonymity, I bought a ticket to London, and as soon as I'd packed a few necessary items.
But do you know, Holmes, who it is?
Do you, Watson?
Me, I said, looking at Holmes as he gazed into the flames. Well, why should I know?
Previous cases, perhaps?
Holmes said.
Anything that feels familiar?
A lock of hair and a key? I said, shaking my head. It could be anyone, Holmes.
Indeed.
Holmes said, standing up and opening a drawer on the table now situated before my old room. He came back with a small wooden box. Opening it, he placed on the table a curl of hair and a small silver key. He also placed the letter with a plea for help. I looked at these items and then back at Holmes.
What do you see, Watson?
He asked. Well, a lock of hair tied with a clasp at its top. Auburn hair, I see, but with flecks of grey.
Meaning?
Well, no longer a young person. Oh, though hair can go grey with time.
Excellent, Watson.
A silver key. The kind you would open a locker with, perhaps, or a box?
Excellent, Watson, well done.
Said Holmes, standing near the fire.
You'll find
He said
that the key is scuffed in a few places, meaning it has been frequently used. The outer edge is worn on the top surface, indicating this key was once attached to a chain. The hair, as you rightly say, has fine grey within its lock and has been trimmed back from its longer length. The hair is very fine, has been attended to, cut and washed, with very fine fragments curling from its base. It is from a woman's head, of whom, I would say, is very well fashioned, judging by the quality of care and attention. The sample was not recently cut and sealed, however, hence the grey, as you rightly say. The key and the hair together are the clue.
And the danger, Holmes?
The letter.
Oh, of course.
The second part of our narrative, Watson, will inform you of that.
As we waited, the shadows crept along Baker Street, finally extinguishing the evening's colours. The buildings opposite became a gradual darker grey, and the street a misty hue. Street lamps were lit, and the yellow glow from the various houses opposite blazed brighter in the darkening night. Holmes stood by the window and once more glanced into the street below. Mr. Jacobi had prepared a few items that now lay on the wooden table next to the lock of hair and the silver key. The clock ticked louder than I remembered, for we had lapsed into a silence. Finally, I said to Holmes's inquiry, "I remember the Carlyle and Carstairs case, of course. Sir Joseph Carlyle being a most prominent rubber baron. It was in all the newspapers."
Only so much information emerges from newspapers, Watson.
"Indeed, but enough to know that an unfortunate man deserved a better end, perhaps."
Tell me, Watson,
Holmes said, moving to the fire once more and warming his hands.
what do you record of the case?
Well, I remember Sir Joseph Carlyle cutting his son out of his will. The son furious because his father remarried, and the second wife, Lola, I think her name was.
You are correct, Watson.
Said Holmes, sitting down opposite.
Your record is admirable. Continue.
Lola inherited the vast majority of the estate after Carlyle died, the son getting very little.
Stepson.
Holmes corrected. Yes, stepson, that's right. Well, the curious part was Carlyle's death, falling down the stairs in the middle of the night. He was sick and of ill health, so the accident was thought to be an unfortunate effect of his illness. But later it transpired the stepson, James?
Correct again, Watson?
James wanted the suspicious circumstances of his father's death opened for investigation, alluding to the idea that the accident was not an idea, but perhaps murder.
Yes.
Lola Carlyle, née Carstairs, took him to court, and the investigation into the old man's death was reopened, but James Carlyle lost due to lack of evidence.
Admirable, Watson, admirable.
Lola got the lot, and James Carlyle was broken and defeated.
Indeed. Apt description, Watson.
Now, the man disappeared from public life, living remotely, a bitter recluse. Lady Lola still lives at the estate and may remarry, I believe, for a second time.
A third time, Carlyle was husband number 2.
I see. But what has all this to do with you, Holmes, or for that matter, that lock of hair or silver key?
Lola Carlyle disappeared last week.
Abducted?
They're not sure. Her things were in her room, but she never came back from her morning stroll.
Well, that doesn't mean abduction, surely. Maybe she's lost, or...
And a parson saw who he believed to be Lady Lola struggling with a man in a laneway near her home. She was pushed into a car and driven away.
You believe this, Holmes? That she's in great danger?
I believe she's in great danger, yes, but not from her attacker.
Well, how can that be the case? If he manhandled her into the car and then drove away and she hasn't been seen since, then we must presume he is her assailant.
Under other circumstances, perhaps I'd agree with you, Watson, but you are forgetting the items. I was sent through the post. If I told you these items were sent to me by Lady Lola, what would you say?
Well, that's incredible, Holmes. Why on earth would she send them to you?
Look at these again. The hair, the key, the note. The note is written on fine-lined paper, embossed. The words, "Help me, Holmes, help me," are written very neatly on one side of the top of the paper, not scrawled like a note of desperation, but simply stated like an instruction. This person isn't in a corner of fear, but calmly requesting my help.
I see your point, Holmes.
Well, you must understand the writer. They did not sign the note, have not indicated who they may be, but they have alluded to one important fact.
Which is?
They know I know who they are by admission. They perceive I will endure to unlock their personality from these sparse clues, because either they know my methods of deduction, or they know me personally, or both, of course, Watson.
Well, that makes sense, Holmes, I agree, but wouldn't it have been easier to have simply written her name along the bottom of the notepaper? Holmes smiled, and rising, picked up the notepaper once more.
If this went astray, Watson, if arriving here at my own old abode, it was opened by someone who is not me, and who is not as inscrutable here as Mr. Jacobi, what clues to identification does the blackmailer have? The letter reveals nothing of the writer's personality, and the lock of hair is just a lock of brown hair going slightly grey. The key is just a key, without any hint of what lock it should fit into. If the sender does not hear from me, she will presume I didn't get the missive, and she will continue into whatever darkness she has surrounding her alone.
I see, Holmes. Yes, very clever. But how does Lady Lola know you? I cannot recall the name from any of our past adventures. When I read about her, I didn't think she was familiar to me. Why would you think she and the sender of this letter are one and the same?
The three items, Watson.
Holmes said, picking up the hair and the key.
Let us think about what Lady Lola is trying to tell me if we settle on the idea that this is from her. The hair is from the past, once auburn, now greying. The note is present, help me. The key is perhaps the future. The facts of a thrice-married woman involved in intrigue and mystery, and a suspicious death thrown in for good measure, leads me to follow a trail of elimination from my own past. We must think, do we know any ladies from our adventures together who fit that bill?
I sat forward thinking while Holmes relit his pipe, throwing the discarded match into the fire. I'm not sure, Holmes. There were so many women who came through that door, either in great distress or having a strange story to tell. But without looking through my past notes, I cannot recall all their names. Or one or two, perhaps, if I could have a few moments of contemplation. Well, certainly no women with the name of Lola. Well, she may have changed her name.
Go on, Watson.
Well, the only one who really jumps out from memory, and only if you don't mind me saying, Holmes, because of your relationship with her before we knew one another. And that is... I stopped and caught Holmes looking at me, a slight smile curling the edges of his lips, his pipe clenched between his teeth as fresh smoke billowed towards the ceiling.
Continue, Watson, you were saying,
he said calmly. Oh, goodness, Holmes. Lady Lola is...
Indeed, Watson, I think she is.
The woman? Holmes smiled at my memory of that long ago uttered phrase.
Yes, Watson, the woman. You know, Watson, life tends in circular ways. The past is not necessarily buried, but continues its course either through memory or by re-emergence. To you it may have been a completed intrigue written up for the entertainment of others. But for me, it has grown like a long shadow at dusk.
Irene Adler, Holmes.
Once I knew who had sent the missive, Jacobi here did the rest. We planned the visible abduction, and Lady Lola has been staying nearby. That was a week ago, and we made contact, and tonight we have arranged to meet.
How did you know Irene Adler was the Lady Lola, Holmes? Holmes smiled.
If the key fits,
he said enigmatically. Jacobi moved to the window. Holmes glanced in his direction and followed. He looked at Mr. Jacobi and nodded very slightly. What is it, Holmes?
It is the signal we've been waiting for.
I joined Holmes at the window, and there in the dusk a hackney carriage idled on the corner of Baker Street. Mr. Jacobi crossed to the door and left us alone.
Jacobi is letting our guests know it is all clear.
I saw Jacobi cross the street and stand on the pavement conversing with the driver. Then, after a few moments, a lady stepped from the cab and Jacobi escorted her across the street towards 221B. Holmes turned towards the fire. He breathed deeply, and I could see by his manner he was deeply disturbed.
Watson,
he said, looking grave.
Whatever happens now must be on our terms, and not because we have emotions tied to the past.
I agreed, but pointed out rather carefully, I thought that I did not indeed have an emotional tie to the past, and only he would be unfortunately inclined that way.
Indeed.
he said noncommittally. Finally, we heard steps on the stairway, and then an elegant woman swept into the room wearing an old-fashioned gown with a veil covering her face and a feathered boa hat. The lady looked the very description of the word lady, howbeit from a time before the Great War. I had the inclination she purposely remained in a time she felt best fitted her personality. Holmes looked across the room, and as she lifted her veil, he quickly stepped forward, bowed his head, and kissed her hand.
Lady Carlisle,
He said, keeping his head bowed. Sherlock, the lady said, almost like a whisper. Then she added, Dear Sherlock. Holmes looked up into her face, an older, wiser, greyer face of 30 years before, still striking, full of her rare beauty. Her dark eyes shone with tears. As she and Holmes held on to each other for a moment, I saw the years fall to dust and they transported to that timeless place of deep and binding friendship. Holmes stood up and with his senses still reasonably intact, he coughed and turned his head away towards the window and gestured towards me.
You know Dr. Watson, of course?
He said, clearing his throat. Yes, of course, Lady Carlisle said, and offered her hand. How nice to see you once again. There was a moment in which none of us could speak, the occasion seemingly larger than a few murmured pleasantries. Then finally Lady Carlisle sat near the fire.
You've been looked after?
Holmes asked. Yes, thank you. Most pleasant. Lady Carlisle looked at the objects on the table, and in doing so, saw the revolvers Jacobi had laid out beside them. Sherlock, she said, disturbed, do you think that will be necessary?
I hope not.
Holmes said.
But to be prepared is a better way to do business, I think.
I'm sure you're right. Lady Carlisle looked at Holmes again and smiled. You have retired, I hear.
I have.
You no longer live here.
It is true, Lady Carlisle.
Oh, Sherlock, Lady Carlisle suddenly exclaimed. Stop, please. Irene, please. I hate Lady and I loathe Carlisle.
Nevertheless, that's who you are now, Lady... Irene. And to wed again, I hear.
That story will have to wait,
No doubt,
said Holmes graciously. I stood near the fire and suddenly, with no more patience, asked to the room, would somebody please tell me what is going on?
This lady is in great danger. She had to make her way to London under great secrecy before another guest arrives. I will explain, Watson, but let us prepare for our guest.
Mr. Jacobi loaded the revolvers and handed one to me.
You still know how to use one, Watson?
Of course, Holmes. I've never forgotten. Jacobi took a pistol for himself, and Holmes doused the lights. The fire glowed in the dark of the room, sending frightening shadows across the ceiling. Irene Adler, to revert to her real name, sat by the table.
If my calculations are correct, the gentleman in question will have the telegram by now.
I gather someone is coming here who we judge to be worthy of armed combat, I said despairingly. Holmes turned to Irene.
Would you mind letting Watson know the rest of the tale, Miss Adler?
Dear Watson, thrown in so readily, Miss Adler said with a smile, after so many years.